All right, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for a discussion of the Biden Harris administration's first 100 days in office. My name is Kate Nielsen, and I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy, Legal Advocacy, and Research for AAUW. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues Letty Bustillos, Federal Policy Manager, and Robin Lucas, Grassroots Advocacy Manager, for our discussion. So, in December, we penned a letter on behalf of over 170,000 members and supporters of AAUW to the incoming administration. We offered our thoughts on executive actions that they could take immediately to support the economic security and education of women and girls. In line with our mission and strategic plan, our recommendations were lumped into three general buckets: COVID relief, economic security, and education. We also asked that the administration make their appointees, the people that they are putting in place to do this work, look like America. So now that we've reached that 100 days mark, what did we ask for, and have they gotten it done? So, in short, the answer is they've done pretty well. The full letter that I just referenced is available on our website, and I encourage you to check it out. But I'd like to take you through some of the highlights. I want to go section by section with Letty, providing some analysis for us. So Letty, with regard to COVID, our request centered on ensuring that the recovery doesn't just, quote, return us to normal, but helps create a more equitable normal. Which executive pieces address this, and what are some of the highlights of the first 100 days?
Thanks, Kate, for the question, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Well, Kate, a great deal has happened these 100 days that I would say has us hopeful about the direction of the coming days and the coming months. To start, I would say the American Rescue Plan had a number of provisions that benefited Americans broadly, but benefited women and families in particular to weather the worst of the pandemic and really begin this long road to recovery. And they did so by providing stimulus payments, funding to address food and housing insecurity, substantial relief dollars directed to child care providers to pay their employees and other essentials, and funding to help families struggling to pay the cost of child care. I would say that these investments, particularly the ones dedicated to the childcare sector, are ones we will see in other executive actions we will discuss a little later when we talk about the American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan. Additionally, I would highlight that some of these executive orders are definitely very exciting. I can't emphasize enough the importance of the president's executive order on advancing racial equity, which explicitly acknowledges the damaging effects that structural and systemic racism have had on our communities of color, and the role of government to advance racial equity and provide access to opportunities and benefits. I would say similarly, the executive order on gender identity or sexual orientation directs agency heads to fully enforce Title VII and other laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation, and is in alignment with the Supreme Court's ruling in Bostock v. Clayton County.
Awesome. Thanks, Letty. I have the same question about what the administration has done on economic security.
Okay, so a few highlights from the American Rescue Plan that I think are worth noting include the extension of unemployment benefits with the provision that the first $10,000 of benefits would be tax-free for households with annual incomes that are less than $150,000. The president makes further investments in unemployment benefits in his non-defense discretionary budget, which was released in early April, to ensure that states can better handle the higher volumes of claims, especially as we saw what took place during the pandemic over this last year. In addition, the expansion of the child tax credit and the change to periodic payments to families will help them offset costs that they face day to day, as opposed to signing them in one annual payment. Last, and I would say perhaps one of the most important and critical changes made in the American Rescue Plan is the provision that makes any college loan forgiveness between December 31st, 2020 and January 1st, 2026 tax-free, which would ensure that borrowers whose debt is fully or even partially forgiven are not saddled with thousands of dollars in surprise taxes. I would note that just last week, he issued an executive order on increasing the minimum wage for federal contractors, which would increase their wages to $15 per hour and increases the wages for tipped workers to $10.22 per hour, both of which would begin on January 30th of 2022. in his proclamation on National Pay Equity Day, Payday, excuse me, on Equal Pay Day on March 24th, he called for the passage of the Paycheck Fairness Act, which is AAUW's top priority for the 117th Congress. And I would be remiss if I didn't call out the president's support for the Raise the Wage Act, which he urged members of Congress to pass in his joint address that he had last week.
Awesome. Thank you. And finally, I want to turn to education. Obviously, the pandemic has turned our educational system just absolutely upside down, which makes it more important than ever to ensure that all students receive an equitable education, including equal access. What can you tell me about what the administration has done thus far in that realm?
Absolutely. So the pandemic has definitely turned education upside down, and unfortunately, students have borne the cost from the crisis. Again, going back to the American Rescue Plan, $130 billion was provided to K-12 schools to reopen. But even more importantly than that was the requirement that at least 20% of the funds provided be used to address learning loss. An additional 40 billion went to higher education to both address school reopenings as with K-12, but also to address revenue shortages, which has unfortunately led to historic pandemic-driven job losses in the higher education sector. Earlier this month, President Biden unveiled his non-defense discretionary budget request. Try say that 3 times, otherwise known as the skinny budget, with a significant boost to education funding, notably a 41% increase to the Department of Education, which is huge. The allocation would more than double funding for Title I, would increase funding for the Child Care Development Block Grant and Head Start, and a substantial investment will go to help schools hire more counselors, nurses, and mental health professionals as more schools reopen. So on the higher education side, the president's budget request would increase funding for historically Black colleges and universities, minority-serving institutions, and community colleges, as well as increase funding for Pell Grants, which would raise the maximum award size by $400 and make Dreamers eligible to receive these grants. I would say that the plan would more equitably support Department of Justice Violence Against Women Act programs at HBCUs, HSIs, and tribal colleges. And last, I would say that there is I would highlight the significant investments in research funding opportunities at both HBCUs and MSIs to expand STEM initiatives, to attract and retain underserved and underrepresented students in engineering and other STEM fields.
That's great. Thank you. That's a lot.
Indeed.
And I realize that you're really just scratching the surface there. I see a question about MSIs. That's a minority serving institution. And HBCU is historically Black college and university. So yes, please, I know that we speak in acronyms and often speak quickly, so apologies, trying to slow down. These slides will be available, and a lot of this information, I'll mention this again at the end, but a lot of this information is available on the website. We publish letters, comments, testimonies, and legal briefs. And that is really a nice overview of a lot of this work. So if you feel like you can't keep up with some of it, I definitely recommend going there to check it out, to get more in-depth coverage of some of the things that we're talking about. Letty, I did want to ask one more thing. Is there anything that you think is particularly exciting about what the administration has done? Is there anything that you feel like they sort of went above and beyond what we'd hoped or expected?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that 2 executive orders, executive actions stand out. The first, the President Biden issued an executive order on March 8th, directing the Secretary of Education to complete a review of changes to Title IX regulations that were enacted last year. Very exciting to see that. In response to this executive action, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights announced on April 6th that they would undertake a comprehensive review of Title IX regulations. This comprehensive review would include a public hearing that would enable members of the public to share important insights on sexual harassment in school environments. OCR will develop a Q&A guidance document to provide additional clarity about how OCR interprets schools' existing obligations and the areas in which schools have discretion in their procedures to address reports of sexual harassment. And last, in this particular executive action, OCR anticipates publishing in the Federal Register a notice of proposed rulemaking to amend the department's Title IX regulations and offer members of the public another opportunity to offer comment. So that is incredibly exciting for us to see that Title IX will be addressed in the coming months. The second executive action that I would highlight is the establishment of the Gender Policy Council, which was also signed on March 8th. The council works across executive departments and agencies, including the Domestic Policy Council, the National Security Council, and the National Economic Council, to provide a coordinated federal response on issues that have a distinct impact on gender equity. The GPC covers a range of issues such as economic security, health, gender-based violence, and education, and pays particular attention to the barriers faced by women and girls. The council is co-chaired by Jennifer Klein, who also serves as the council's executive director, and Julissa Reynoso, who also serves as the First Lady's chief of staff. And last, I definitely want to take some time to acknowledge the president's efforts, Kate, like you mentioned, to have a cabinet that represents America. Among his historic firsts include the first female vice president and Treasury Secretary. It includes the first openly gay cabinet secretary confirmed by the Senate and the first Native American secretary. A couple of facts that are worth highlighting: half of his cabinet members are non-white and 46% are women. And among the 315 administration positions, 42% are people of color and 59% are women. And while there are areas where more work definitely is needed, such as the lack of AAPI appointments, Asian American Pacific Islander appointments, it was definitely a special moment to see Interior Secretary Holland take the oath of office from Vice President Harris. Ultimately, I'd like to say that representation matters, and who sits at the table matters for the policies we care most about. So to reiterate what the president said last week in his joint address to Congress, it's about time.
I couldn't agree more, Letty.
Kate, would you mind talking a little bit more about the Gender Policy Council? Like, their name obviously has been coming up a little bit more this year since they're new, but I personally think it's pretty cool that AAUW has direct access to such an important office.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Absolutely. So as Letty mentioned, the Gender Policy Council sits within the White House and is staffed by some friends of the organization. I will admit that I went through a little period of time where I was getting a bunch of announcements of moving on, but not far, from friends at other organizations who are now staffed there. And I have the privilege of meeting with them every other week, which is a really great opportunity to hear what they're thinking, how they plan to approach this work, and also to keep the lines of communication open. They're really interested in hearing what we think and getting real, genuine input on some of these policy proposals. I know Letty's going to talk more about the American Jobs and Families Plans in a little bit, but when the American Families Plan was rolled out with the announcement about paid leave, it was a really exciting moment for a lot of people in this community, because we'd crafted that and we'd worked really hard with them. So it's neat to have open lines of communication, really willing partners willing to listen to our ideas and implement them. So I'm really excited that that office is in place and that the people who are staffing it are good actors who are willing to not just push out information, which is a luxury in and of itself, but to hear genuine ideas to help craft policy. So it's a really big win. Okay, so I want to get back to picking Letty's brain. So far, this has been a pretty feel-good recap of the first 100 days, the promises made and kept. But I think that there have still been some shortcomings. Is there anything that you're disappointed with this administration about thus far?
Yeah, I would have to say that not enough work has been done to address student debt. While student loan payments and interest accruals have been paused through September 30th, I would say that the uncertainty about what happens post-September weighs heavily on the minds and figuratively on the backs of borrowers. Student debt has reached an astronomical $1.7 trillion that impacts more than 44 million borrowers. And President Biden, over these last several months, has stressed his preference for congressional action to address student debt and with a ceiling of $10,000 in forgiveness, which is a far cry from what is proposed by Senators Schumer and Warren, who unveiled a resolution calling for the cancellation of $50,000 in student debt via executive action. I would say that canceling $50,000 in student debt, according to the research, will provide relief to approximately 80% of federal student borrowers, and I think that's something that we need now. We can't afford to wait.
Wow, thank you. Can you also just spend like a minute or two talking about why this matters? You just said the gravity and expanse of the number of borrowers who could be affected, but I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there about student debt and assumptions about who the people are who have debt, if they're making poor decisions, managing their money poorly, or that this is only an issue for 20-somethings.
Indeed. So let me start by saying that student loan debt prevents millions of borrowers from doing things like buying homes, starting businesses, saving for retirement, or even starting families. So allow me to put this into context with just a few facts. Imagine a pie. In that pie, about 75% of student loan borrowers took loans to go to 2- and 4-year colleges. The remaining piece of that pie, 25% of students, borrowed money to go to graduate school. That's still outstanding. However, when you look at a secondary pie of the amount of money borrowed, we would say that about half of the money borrowed was for students who went to 2-year and 4-year colleges, and the other half is borrowed by students who went to graduate school. So graduate school is also part of this student loan problem. In addition to those, that kind of lays out who is borrowing money, I would have to say that where one goes to school makes a huge difference. For example, among public 4-year schools, 12% of bachelor's degree graduates owe more than $40,000. But among those who went to for-profit schools, nearly half of students have loans that exceed $40,000. So again, schools where they attend make a difference. Prior to the pandemic pause on student loans, approximately 11% of loans were in default. And the highest default rates are among students who attended for-profit institutions, and defaults are highest among those with small debts. In other words, those who borrowed less than $6,500 are more likely to default than those who borrowed more than $24,000. Again, really striking these statistics. But you know what? It's not just students who have loans. Data show that the average annual borrowing by parents has more than tripled over the last 25 years. Approximately 8.5 million borrowers ages 15 and over owe about $49 billion in student debt. And we also know that about 114,000 borrowers ages 50 and older had their Social Security garnished to pay for student debt. And of that number, which was incredibly startling, about 67,000 are living below the poverty line. I really don't have any words. So when we think about it, we need help now. The promise of college degree is real. We know that over the course of a full-time career, the typical U.S. worker with a bachelor's degree has the potential to earn nearly $1 million more than a similar worker with just a high school diploma. But unfortunately, that promise rings hollow because students are asked to essentially mortgage their futures because, among other things, states have severely disinvested from public colleges and universities, which makes college severely unaffordable for many students and their families. Thus, they have to borrow loans. As one student said, it's a lot easier to borrow money to go to college than it is to get any kind of grants or other kind of assistance. So student debt is a huge problem. It's a gender issue. It's a racial equity issue. And we need to take some action sooner rather than later.
I also want to make sure that everyone knows to expect a small update to AAUW's Deeper in Debt report in time for graduation this year. I'm going to drop a link in the chat just now so that you know where to find it and any updates that will happen in the future for it. Thank you for reviewing all of that, Letty.
Yeah, thank you, Letty. Although I wish it was a more positive review, but obviously a really critical issue. Okay, so let's pivot to Congress now. The first 100 days marks the beginning of the new administration, and technically the 117th Congress has been in session for a few weeks more. But obviously these two branches of government are inextricably linked. And like it or not, the success of one greatly impacts the success of the other. So as with the new administration, we wrote a letter to all members of Congress in January outlining our legislative requests for them. While there is significant overlap in the themes between the two letters, the congressional letter focused squarely on bills we want to see them pass. For the most part, these bills aren't new. These are pieces of legislation that we've been advocating for years, if not decades. So Letty, can you give us a rundown of our familiar old friends? Which bills have been reintroduced and are moving along this session?
Yes, indeed. Well, I am happy to report that a good number of the bills that we support have definitely seen the light of day either in the House, the Senate, or in both. So let me give you a quick rundown and I'll mention 9 of them in particular. So the first one, the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would update and strengthen the Equal Pay Act, passed the House on April 15th, so something to celebrate. The resolution to remove the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment also passed the House with bipartisan support. The Raise the Wage Act, which increases the minimum wage to $15 an hour and phases out the outdated sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, was introduced in both the House and the Senate. The Family Act, which was introduced in both the House and the Senate, would create a national family and medical leave insurance program to help ensure that people who work can take the time they need to address serious health and caregiving needs. The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act was introduced in the House in February and in the Senate last week. And the bill prohibits employment practices that discriminate against making reasonable accommodations for qualified employers affected by things like pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. The Equality Act passed the House in February and prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. H.R. 1, otherwise known as the For the People Act, which expands voting rights and addresses election integrity, passed the House in early March. The Healthy Families Act, which would guarantee working people the ability to earn up to 7 paid sick days a year to recover from short-term illnesses, was introduced in April. And the last one, the STEM Opportunities Act, which requires federal science agencies to collect demographic data on all grant applicants and implement policies to minimize the impact of implicit bias, was introduced in January. So that was a mouthful, but we're very excited to see that those have been introduced.
Let me interject here real quick. For everyone listening, we know this is quite a long list to follow. The content of this webinar, there's just a lot of information. So again, I'm trying to drop some helpful links to send you to in the chat. Again, the webinar is recorded as well, so you can always come back and watch again. But for this one, you can find a list of a lot of the legislation that Letty just went over that we include our analyses and positions for AAUW on via the 2-Minute Activist page that I am dropping a link in the chat to right now. So back to you, Letty. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Appreciate that. So, Kate, before we move on to other areas of discussion, I was wondering if you can say a little bit about the Paycheck Fairness Act and those aspects of, how the sausage is made and that we not only see day to day, but the role that we play to help crank the sausage out.
Absolutely. So I think as most attendees are well aware, we've worked on the Paycheck Fairness Act for decades and decades. I think we're about to reach the 24-year mark. But we're making really good progress. It did pass the House of Representatives for the 4th time just a few weeks ago. And as the bill sponsor, Rosa DeLauro, has said, 4th time's the charm. So what that looks like from our end is a lot of work with the bill sponsor and the committee staff to be able to work through any changes that we want to see in the bill, because it has evolved over time. And that means suggestions on specific language changes, and then providing information to members in sort of a Q and FAQ format, as they consider changes on how it will alter what's in the bill and what it really means, in real life, so that they can make decisions about whether they still want to support it or not. So we've done a lot of behind the scenes work in that angle. We also do sort of real-time rapid response work. When it was being debated by the Rules Committee and on the floor, we were on various email and text chains to be able to answer timely questions, and head off any issues at the pass. At one point, the bill sponsor, Rosa DeLauro, said verbatim some words that we had written, which is always exciting to hear that from the House floor. And then we get to celebrate when it's passed, and turn our attention to the next chamber. So right now, we're working really hard to think through our strategy in the Senate. We are trying to figure out what we need to do to get it passed. As I'm sure many folks are aware, because it doesn't have a component around finance, it needs 60 votes to beat the filibuster. And as important as I think this bill is, I do not think it's going to be the one that we bust the filibuster over. So that means that in addition to the 50 Democrats and independents who are co-sponsors of the bill currently, we need to find 10 Republicans to get it through the Senate. So we're currently developing strategy for how to get that done. And as Robin will talk more about later, that's also where you all come in, so that you can put pressure on those senators if you live in their states, to tell them why this is important to you and what really matters. But it's really interesting work. You all are a critical piece of it, and we're really excited for what will be coming up in the coming weeks and months as we try and get it through the Senate. Letty, I want to turn it back to you. You just ran through nine bills that are making some good progress, but I know that there's a few others that we have supported in the past that we haven't seen yet on the introduced in Congress. Can you talk about what you're hoping to see and what you're watching for?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there are still several of our bills that have not yet been introduced, but we are looking forward to seeing them in the coming months, particularly these four that I will highlight. The Be Heard Act is a bill that would take critical steps toward addressing workplace harassment, including sexual harassment, and ensuring workplaces are free from discrimination. The Empower Act would increase transparency and training in the workplace, making it less dangerous for employees to come forward and report inappropriate behavior. GIA provides additional resources, training, and technical assistance to educational entities to support compliance with Title IX. And then the last one is the Halt on-campus Sexual Violence Act, which strengthens prevention efforts by federal government and colleges and universities nationwide to eradicate and respond appropriately to sexual violence and other forms of discriminatory harassment and gender-based violence. So these are the four among a couple of others that we are definitely looking forward to see being introduced.
I feel like this is the quote for today, but wow, that is a lot. That's a lot of very critical, important issues that people in our country are facing. How do you keep up and plan to tackle so many of these urgent issues that you're talking about, Letty?
Well, just keep monitoring, keep tracking, and definitely working with our coalition partners. So one of the things that we recognize is that we can't do it all. You know, we simply do not have the bandwidth or to do everything. So a critical aspect of our work is building partnerships and working with our coalition, with other coalition members, to make sure that we're on top of all of these bills, that making sure that when asks are made by staffers, by other groups on particular issues, that we're as responsive as we possibly can. It's interesting, you know, unemployment insurance is definitely not something that, you know, we've historically addressed, but given what we saw with the pandemic, given what we saw with the impact on women, the loss of jobs, unemployment insurance is a very particular critical issue for our community. So here we are addressing unemployment insurance. We recognize we're not the experts, but working closely with our coalition partners to make sure that we're adding our input to, to getting it moving forward.
And I'll just add, I see a question specifically about who our primary coalition partners are, and there are so many of them. We have a lot depending on which issues we're talking about. I encourage you to look at some of the letters that are posted on our website. There's a lot of coalition letters there, and you can read who the other partners are who have signed on. So if you have a particular issue that you're interested in, you can find a letter on that bill and go and see who else is involved and who we're working with. And similarly, I also just wanted to address one question. I believe there's a question about the third item that was an acronym, and I think what you're referring to is GEA, the Gender Equity and Education Act, GEEA, and it's a bill of strengthening Title IX that we've long supported. Alrighty, let's see here. Great. So we've covered the administration and we've covered Congress. So Letty, now that we've sort of hashed that out, what can we think about what's to come? What can we look forward to? How can we figure out how to enact positive legislation? I know that you've mentioned the American Rescue, Jobs and Families plans a few times. Can you talk about those, since those seem to be kind of top of mind and top of news and what we're working on?
Sure thing. So where do I start? These are really expansive plans. So I'll try to highlight a few key points that are striking for us in our critical issue areas that we're following. So President Biden shared with the American public his ideas for how to build back better. First with coronavirus relief, as we saw via the American Rescue Plan, and now with recovery via the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. These plans, in effect, is the administration's, we'll say, stake in the ground on what they want to see the Congress take action on and enact. It also serves, they also serve as a vital communication tool to message to the American people his vision for the country and a vehicle to rally support. And polling show that the public do support these two plans. So while these plans provide a roadmap, it is still up to the Congress to enact legislation. So for example, the American Rescue Plan proposed an increase to the federal minimum wage from $7.25 per hour to $15 per hour. However, when the act went to Congress, when the plan went to Congress and it was being legislated, this proposal of raising the minimum wage ultimately didn't make it, and didn't make it into the final rescue act. And so other actions need to be taken to see, the $15 minimum wage through, say, Raise the Wage Act. So that's kind of how the plans work themselves out from what the administration proposes. These are our ideas, our big picture vision, to what Congress will ultimately do.
Great, thank you. And can you talk a little bit about your favorite pieces of these proposals?
Okay, so like I said, they're very expansive. So let me start with the American Jobs Plan and those pieces that I in particular find really interesting and will definitely be following. So with regard to economic security, the plan provides funding for workers facing some of the greatest challenges, such as efforts to tackle long-term unemployment and underemployment, and invest in a new dislocated workers program that helps workers, find jobs and address other needs. The plan also invests in HBCUs and MSIs, historically black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions, to upgrade research infrastructure in labs and new registered apprenticeship slots to strengthen the pipeline for more women and people of color, which is very exciting. It further supports the creation of STEM pathway programs in middle and high schools, and supports community college partnerships to deliver job training programs based on the most in-demand skills that are needed right now. There are significant investments proposed to upgrade and build new public schools for community college infrastructure and to help create up to, I think it's 200 centers of excellence that serve as research incubators at HBCUs and MSIs, and will provide graduate fellowships and other opportunities for underserved populations. Last, but certainly not least, is the investment in the care economy, with funding allocated to increase access to quality, affordable home and community-based care, as well as support for well-paying caregiving jobs. In addition, funds are dedicated to help upgrade childcare facilities and increase the supply of childcare in areas that need it the most.
That's some really exciting stuff.
And a lot.
I'd like to echo Letty that how comprehensive both of those plans are. It addresses so many really urgent issues for women and families in the United States right now. But Kate, can I ask what the viability of these plans might be?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we saw the American Rescue Plan enacted. And as Letty mentioned, it wasn't exactly what the administration had proposed, but there was some real faithfulness to the plan. And I anticipate something similar with the jobs and families plans. As Letty said, this is going to have to be hashed out in the halls of Congress. The administration can shoot for pie in the sky, but that doesn't mean that Congress is going to agree to it. I think it's pretty obvious that it has an easier road in the House than in the Senate. And these do have a slightly easier road in the Senate in terms of only needing 51 votes, with Vice President Harris being able to be that tie-breaking vote. That being said, we have a whole lot of priorities bills that aren't part of those two plans, as expansive as they are and as much as there's good stuff in them. And the Senate poses a real problem. I think, as Letty sort of teed up with, one of our disappointments with the administration is in the student debt realm, and that's very policy focused. I think one of our big disappointments with Congress is Senate being, a real backstop and holding up a lot of the plans that we have and the hopes for our future. Legislating is really hard work. And I think in the past, for many, it's been good enough to stop legislation, right? But to pass expansive, sort of culture shifting legislation is really hard. We're seeing that within the Democratic Party, that there's different factions that they can't always agree. Obviously, the Republican Party disagrees with much of, if not all of, what the Democratic Party is proposing. So those two factions are rubbing together. And as I've mentioned several times, the filibuster is a serious issue and something that we're watching closely and trying to figure out what's appropriate in terms of calling for its abolishment, which I think many of us are aligned to, given the need to move forward legislation that will substantially impact women and girls and make their futures brighter. It's a tough question, right? I want to be really hopeful. I want to be really optimistic, but it's a tough road on a lot of our priority issues. That being said, I think with the pandemic right now and the ways that our country is hurting, in terms of the health crisis, the resulting economic crisis, and a lot of the racial unrest and reckoning with our country's really unacceptable history of racism, we are in a moment where I think some things can move, and there are sometimes sort of unnatural bedfellows who can maybe work together to get this work done in a meaningful way. But I want to actually take this as a pivot point and turn it back to you, Robin, to talk about how it is that we are going to get this done. You just asked me about viability, and I want to ask you about action, and just talk about how we engage on this, how we make sure that it does get done.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much going on right now, and this makes me first glad that we have this webinar and the recording from this webinar that people can listen to in their own time, but also just to engage generally. As many of you know, the action alerts that are listed in the 2-Minute Activist page that I linked earlier in the chat are immediate ways to contribute your advocacy abilities and efforts. With so many actions that are ongoing, We know that the process of updating and directing our advocates to which actions need their attention now becomes that much more important. And also a reminder that the Washington Update newsletter from the public policy team is emailed out to all members and advocates with the 2-Minute Activist program every few weeks as both a roundup of engagement opportunities for y'all and also for opportunity for some deep dive learning on really nitty-gritty issues like we're talking about today. If you have any trouble receiving or accessing emails, please contact me at advocacy@auw.org and I'll help you out with that. But to overall answer your question, I'm thrilled at the opportunity for our community to listen and talk to us today. It really highlighted throughout your conversation with Letty just how truly interconnected a lot of our issue areas are. And in fact, how directly related much of the legislation is that we work on. This interconnectedness has made a really big impact on how I craft our action alerts and indeed how we will be evolving some of our related priority actions together this year. Last webinar, I talked with you about how we look to offer more robust engagement opportunities in our policy campaigns, like the letter to the editor writing or social media guidance, holding important conversations like this with your friends and family, in addition to the traditional contacting your elected officials, of course. But today introduces a shift that we do need in some areas, sharing not only each legislation to advocate for, but providing our advocates with how each of these are core pieces of a larger whole in advancing towards a future with gender equity for all. But it's very exciting to be able to connect those dots today with so many things up in the air.
Thanks, Robin, and thank you for all your work on this, and thank you for all the comments in the chat about how to change hearts and minds and how to do this work and engage with your lawmakers is absolutely critical. So with that in mind, Robin, is there anything in particular that's timely right now that you'd like people to know about?
Absolutely. First of all, tomorrow is Mom's Equal Pay Day, the date that mothers have to work into 2021 to finally reach the pay that fathers took home last year. As we mark both Mom's Equal Pay Day and Mother's Day itself this week, we honor that moms are essential. Today, an action alert went out calling for immediate engagement on two parts. The Paycheck Fairness Act, which is a big step, or will be a big step towards equal pay, that passed the House and is now with the Senate, but also the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which has now been introduced in both chambers of Congress, because no pregnant person should be forced to choose between their jobs and following their doctor's healthcare advice. So, in honor of Mom's Equal Pay Day, Mother's Day, and every day, please contact your elected officials about both of these critical bills. I also want to highlight, so the background and details shared today around the American Jobs Plan cannot be highlighted enough. Women in this country have been hurting to disproportionate degrees this past year. Black, Hispanic, and Asian American women accounted for all of the job losses over this winter. Women together lost more than 5.4 million jobs in the past 12 months, and 1 in 4 women reported leaving the workforce for lack of childcare during the pandemic. This past year has witnessed the lowest participation rate for women in the workforce in 33 years. So with this movement around the American Jobs Plan, Congress must invest in women in the workforce. Like I said earlier, this is a perfect example of how one core piece of a robust conversation is something that we can focus on now, but needs to be connected with everything else. So overall, we must ensure that women are centered in crisis recovery.
Absolutely. Absolutely vital. Robin, can you just give a quick plug or synopsis for what other action alerts we have available and how people can engage and stay active?
Absolutely. Less of an action alert to contact your elected officials and more something that you can do as an AAUW member. But finally, I do want to highlight this opportunity to uplift women. Please engage with the AAUW national election. Your vote is your voice, and there are a number of critical issues and leadership opportunity or positions that are open for the vote this year. You have until May 17th at 5 p.m. to vote, 5 p.m. Eastern. And I'm going to drop the link to the national election in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, Robin. All right. Well, thank you both to Robin and Letty for that comprehensive and very interesting overview and thorough. I want to just take a second to remind folks about some of the resources that we do have that we've mentioned. Um, we have great resources on our website. We have letters, we have comments, we have testimony, we have amicus briefs that we've either authored ourselves or joined in coalition. These are a really great resource to learn about what we're doing and to learn how to talk about it and pull some talking points. If you're able to meet with your elected officials or give them a call or send them an email, provides really great background. Included within that are our priorities letter to the administration and the 117th congressional priorities, which I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. And finally, we will be releasing the 2021-23 public policy priorities once voting closes, as Robin mentioned. They're largely akin to those you're familiar with from the past years, but we anticipate a few changes to them if they are approved. But they outline our mission and vision and what is so core to who AAUW is and what we advocate for. So I encourage everyone to look to those. Just looking through the questions, we can pivot to questions now. So if anyone has them, please, as a reminder, put them in the Q&A. The chat is for technical issues, but it's a little bit easier for us to work through questions in the Q&A. But I want to direct one to Letty. That's the census is saying there are more professional Latinos in the US than previously thought. Are we doing anything to try and help this population specifically? Can you talk a little bit about the Latina Initiative that you've been spearheading over the last 6 months or so?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to find that census information. I wasn't aware of it, so thank you for pointing that out. So over the last several months, we launched back in the fall. We launched the Latina Policy Initiative, and part of that initiative was to better understand the economic impact the pandemic had on Latinas, and this was looking at Latinas' big picture. And so we conducted both focus groups and individual interviews with Latinas across the country. The states we primarily focused on, and I'm not going to get all of them correct, but it was California, Arizona, Nevada, Illinois, New York, Florida. Yes, I think those are the 6 states. And basically ask them a question: how are they doing? How are they doing both personally and professionally? And what impact has the pandemic had on them? We talked to women who are domestic workers and farm workers. We talked to professional Latinas who are teachers in the medical profession, who are small business owners. And so we really got a wide range of perspectives. On the one hand, we definitely talked to Latina women who were struggling in terms of losing jobs, having to care for their children, having to make the hard decision about, do I go to work or do I stay home to care for my child? Some had chosen to stay home. Others had no choice but to leave their children at home, with older children taking care of younger children. Others struggled with, how do I balance helping them with their schoolwork versus, doing my work, on the computer at home. One of the things that was particularly striking, especially among professional Latinas, was almost this kind of, I would call it survivor's guilt, over the fact that overall they felt that they were okay. They were able to, keep their jobs. They did not see any noticeable decrease in their wages. Their children overall were doing okay, and they could split their time, between working from home and helping their children. But there definitely was that sense of, I feel so bad because others are doing so much worse than me, and I really wish there was something that I could do. And that really is striking in the sense that, especially for Latinas who are probably one generation away from their parents who either immigrated to this country or they were the first in their family to go to college, and the sense that family members were struggling severely while, again, like they said, they were doing okay. So this Latina Policy Initiative is a first start in us really looking at these critical issues impacting Latinas, that we will be releasing a report and several other documents where we will be highlighting their stories and the impact the pandemic has had on them, I would say within, in the next month or so. So please, I invite you all to look out for those resources and learn a little bit more about some of the things that we found in talking to these extraordinary Latinas across the country.
Thank you, Letty. And I just want to emphasize how much work Letty has put into this project. Not just, doing the work, collecting these stories, but she really poured her heart into it. So I'm really excited to have this as part of AUW's portfolio and to be able to center these women and these experiences in our advocacy and have their stories lead the way towards answers, which is, the work that we are doing. It is lifting up the lived experience of women and girls to try and make everyone's lives better. So I'm excited about this. I hope you all will enjoy it when it comes out in the next few weeks. We'll certainly be publicizing it, and a big, big thank you to Letty in the meantime. All right, let's see. I see a question about redistricting and what we're doing on that front. At the federal level, we're working on HR 1. Which Letty mentioned, to try and get some long-term protections in place to make sure that everyone can vote and do so equitably and have fair access to it. And then we're doing a lot of different work at the state levels. As I'm sure everyone knows, the state level is where a lot of the map drawing happens and the nitty-gritty. And some states do it well and some states do it very poorly. State public policy chairs are leading those efforts in the states. So if it's something that you'd like to work on, you can feel free to contact your state public policy chair and discuss what they're doing and how you'd like to get involved. Robin, do you want to take the question about what can those people in states whose senators are already supportive of our stuff can do to help?
Absolutely. That's a very common question that we receive a lot. And my first answer is to still contact your elected officials. They need to hear from you. Because I think a lot of the times when you see someone doing their job right, from your perspective, you might not reach out to them, but it still helps. And all offices do count, all these phone calls and emails. So giving them that support to know that they are representing their constituents correctly and accurately is really important. With that said, I very strongly believe in the power of phoning a friend, but essentially reach out to your friends and family who are not in your locality, because odds are the majority of us know people who are in areas that their elected officials are unfriendly to a lot of our public policy priorities. And this is your turn to kind of grow as an advocate and be the teacher, and really help guide other people in their advocacy and exercising their voice. So I think that's two sides of the same coin, is you practicing what we preach here, but then uplifting and really bringing other people along for the important work of participating in our democracy.
Thanks, Robin. And Letty, you did such a nice job of covering all of the different COVID relief plans and what's going on. We have one question about unemployment benefits and how long they're going to go, and sort of some of the repercussions around those benefits.
So the supplemental benefits available will be available through September 6th. Through the American Rescue Plan, and the supplement that's provided is an additional $300 on top of what states are providing. And I know that there are some comments in relation to, well, people don't want to go back to work because they're making more money in unemployment. I think what I would just say to that is that really speaks a lot to the employment situation across the country, that people would have people would be better off receiving unemployment benefits than they are making a salary at work, which I think goes back to the critical issue of raising the minimum wage to a livable wage, so again, people don't have to make the choice of, do I work or do I stay home with unemployment? I don't think that's a great choice whatsoever, and it really does speak loudly about how we need to change the employment situation across the country. But just going back, the benefits are available through September 6th.
Thank you, Letty. I appreciate that answer. And we are just about out of time. So I'm going to wrap up with one comment that I see that I really like and I think is worth reading out for everyone, which is we find that we can really help new state legislative staff members come up to speed on different bills. They are often very appreciative. I think that's absolutely right and is a nice capstone on all of this information, which hopefully, A, you learned a lot, B, you know where to go to find more, and C, you have a better sense of how to engage with those lawmakers. The policy staff is here to help you if you have further questions, if you need to find information, and if you need help figuring out how to advocate with your legislators. And just a reminder that that means at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, you put them in office, you are their boss, they need to hear from you, and they need to hear what you care about. All that being said, we have a lot of good stuff to come and a lot of action in the coming months. Things to be excited about, things to worry about, things to push on. A lot of steps for you all to take to be active. So we really thank you for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to having you join us on a future webinar. Thanks, everyone. Be safe, be well, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.